Talking to Cornelius. Conversation 11. By the time you arrived in 1844, old man, a significant group of first Tasmanians had been living in exile at Wyballina on Flinders Island for more than a decade. They were separated from the mountains and rivers and valleys and plains, all the vast and intense geography that was their living scripture and communion, all that was their home and the home of their ancestors. And as a meagre substitute, they were living in a place that didn't even have a fresh water supply, a place on the west coast of the small island that was exposed to the vigorous extremes of Bass Strait weather. The trauma of their exile went untended, and their culture was systematically repressed through impoverished circumstances and Western conceit. By 1844, the population of Wyballina had reduced to around 50 of the 134 people who had first arrived. They were sick, traumatised, and dying. And that was a commonly known fact among the Europeans, both free and convicted, who had taken occupation of Van Diemen's Land. The local newspapers reported the poor health and appalling death rate of the first Tasmanians in a tone that blended melancholy with savage condescension. In the first place, the island never was a fit place for such an establishment, and the result is a melancholy proof of the fact that want of water and liberty to roam through the woods, as formerly, has reduced the poor, ignorant savages from several hundreds to the miserable remnant of 50 to 60. Colonial Times, 5th of October, 1844. During your early years as a convict, there was some thought of ending the first Tasmanians' Bass Strait exile, but it was driven by economic considerations rather than any humane sense of trying to make things right with a people whose land had been stolen. Put in the most brute simple terms, bringing the first Tasmanians back to Van Diemen's Land might save the taxpayers money, and given the colony was in one of its regular financial recessions, exacerbated by the money-consuming world of the convict probation system, that was an appealing idea. The experience of invasion, violence, land theft, cultural repression and exile was something the Gaelic Irish had in common with first Tasmanians, but that common experience didn't seem to translate into any strongly expressed sense of solidarity. The Irish lined up with the English in the frontier wars of the 1820s, and they were as prone as any other European to throw out a racist slur or presume a sense of cultural and intellectual superiority. I don't know what you thought or said about the first Tasmanians, old man. There's a certain reassurance that you arrived well after the time of the worst atrocities, but still, there's no getting around the fact that we've made our home and built our lives on beautiful land that was stolen and gained by violent means. Of course, you weren't my first arriving ancestor in Van Diemen's Land. The first one was on my paternal grandmother's line, my nana's great-grandfather, Tom Stubbs. He was a 5'5", brown-haired, blue-eyed Manchester boy with a crucifix tattoo on his right arm. He was 17 when he arrived in Hobart in 1824. He landed a couple of days after the convict Cannibal Pierce was executed. Hobart was mostly small plot farms, spread from the waterfront to the lower foothills of the mountain that they called Table Mountain. The causeway from Hunter Island to the township was barely a year old. Before the causeway, you could always tell a newcomer by their wet feet from crossing the sandbar from the island. The Battery Point side of the cove was still a natural waterline, rising up to the farmland of old Reverend Bobby Knopwood's property. Young Tom was a precocious criminal. He'd spent 2 years imprisoned in Lancaster Castle, overlooking the Loon River, for a previous crime. Tom was transported to Van Diemen's Land for 10 years for feloniously stealing the watch, hat and handkerchief of one James Halliday. Tom had form and attitude. He spent time in the dark cell of a prison hulk before leaving England for using improper language. He'd another bout in solitary for fighting. After he landed in Van Diemen's Land, he spent 7 days on the treadmill for being caught in a state of intoxication. He's the only ancestor I know with a record of feeling the scarifying impact of the cat of nine tails. He was lashed 12 times in one instance for absconding. In another instance, he made it all the way from Birches Bay to Newtown before he was discovered. He was lashed 25 times on that occasion. Tom wasn't so bad as to be sent to Sarah Island in Macquarie Harbour when he first arrived. There were a few troublemakers on the Phoenix too who were sent to there straight away. Tom wasn't in their league, but he also wasn't deemed trustworthy enough to be sent as an assigned servant to some solitary farmer in the Midlands. There was a bit of trouble about Tom, a bit of attitude. I guess he didn't have the advantage of having an older brother around to keep him on the straight and narrow, like you, old man. So Tom did his time through the mid-1820s into the early 1830s with the logging gang at Birches Bay, just south of Hobart. It was a location that would know drama and atrocity during the time that Tom Stubbs was there. We was camped close to Partridge Island when I was a little girl, when a vessel came to anchor without our knowledge of it. A boat came ashore, and some of the men attacked our camp. We all ran away, but one of them caught my mother and stabbed her with a knife and killed her. My father grieved much about her death and used to make a fire at night by himself when my mother would come to him. I had a sister named Marina. She was taken by a sealing boat. I used to go to Birches Bay. There was a party of men cutting timber for the government there. The overseer was Mr. Munro. While I was there, 2 young men of my tribe came for me. One of them was to have been my husband. His name was Parawina. Well, 2 of the Sawyers said they would take us in a boat to Bruny Island, which we agreed to. When we got about halfway across the channel, they murdered the 2 natives and threw them overboard. But one of them held me. Their names was Watkin Lowe and Paddy Newell. The Tasmanian Tribune, 9th of August 1875. I don't have the self-deceiving reassurance that can come from having no ancestors in Van Diemen's Land in the worst time. Tom Stubbs was there in the worst time. He was in the same camp as Watkin Lowe and Paddy Newell. He may well have listened to them boast the fuller story of how they'd thrown the two men overboard in the middle of the channel, then hacked off their hands with a hatchet when they tried to get back on the boat, and how they left the men to bleed and drown, and then went on to rape the 18-year-old girl from Bruny Island. The girl whose name will always be remembered. The girl who was Truganini. Tom Stubbs was there at the time of the roving parties, at the time of the Black Line and the Frontier War and the massacres. Maybe he did no more than eat and sleep and cut down his quota of trees and occasionally get drunk and abscond when there was the opportunity. Maybe that's the sum total of his life as a convict, before he got his ticket of leave and married the convict girl Frances Trudgett, who had known her share of trouble, including the inside of the factory. But convicts were used in the fight against the first Tasmanians, and some convicts took to it with relish. I don't know if my ancestor was part of that violence. It's something I'll probably never know.